My final comment this week is on this appalling set of circumstances in Victoria. We keep on being told about a record number of infections. Not one leader has ever said that such a stat is irrelevant. 99% of all infections worldwide are mild. Victoria has a public administration crisis, and this is its proof. There are 515 people in hospital in Australia, population 25 million. 496 of them are in Victoria, 19 over the rest of Australia. There are 51 serious cases across Australia, 42 in Victoria. Australia-wide, there have been 247 deaths in 6 months. There are more deaths from flu with a vaccine than from coronavirus without one. On the latest Health Department figures, 1,255 deaths from influenza in 1 year, but more than 310,000 presented to hospital, 310,000. We've not had 20,000 coronavirus cases, 20,000 in a population of 25 million, yet Victoria is virtually a police state. 137 of the 162 Victorians who died were in aged care homes. Note the headline of the death of one person on Wednesday in his 30s, but the Victorian Premier refused to say if he had any other medical conditions. The median age of those who've died is 82. Of course, it suits Daniel Andrews to close down the Parliament, to close down the quarantine inquiry, to refuse to answer questions. They cannot answer questions because they say, oh, there's a judicial inquiry. But now the former judge overseeing the inquiry has said the Board of Inquiry is not a court and that, quote, those who are being questioned publicly about matters were free to answer. The long-suffering public are at breaking point. One has written to me to say, Alan, I came to Australia 45 years ago from Russia. For the first time, I feel I'm not in charge of my destiny. Another, Mr Jones, my family did not flee a dictatorial regime in Europe to be forced to live under another one, and in Australia of all places. Another, Mr Andrews shows unconcealable delight as they announce another incredibly large fine. The BLM gang face no penalty. Says George, Mr Andrews could make a name for himself as a fair man, an image he no doubt craves, reintroduce flogging. Says George from Queensland, I'm unaware of any state or country in the world which levies such enormous on-the-spot fines, $4,995. When will the citizenry say enough? Then you have the Sun newspaper in London writing of our trashed reputation. Quote, Australia's second largest city is now subject to some of the most extraordinary COVID lockdown measures on the planet. And all over, it says, an additional 11 deaths. It says the measures are extraordinary, but the pièce de résistance has to be that now police officers can enter homes, says the Sun newspaper, with neither a warrant or permission. Well, with Beirut in the background, one writer has said a nuclear bomb has been detonated under the Victorian economy. And it's time to say it again bluntly. Victoria is in this mess because of the staggering incompetence of its government. What is worse, there's no effective scrutiny, and the media must take a lot of the blame. At press conferences every day, questions that should be asked are not. Scott Morrison offered assistance way back in relation to quarantine. It was rejected. As George wrote to me, fines held Western Centre of almost $5,000 for anyone in breach of dictatorial edicts, but none for Black Lives Matter demonstrators. How does Andrews survive? Well, the answer to that's easy. Forget Alan Jones for a moment. Greg Sheridan, the foreign editor of the Australian newspaper, has brilliantly written today, and I quote, Andrews has connived in the virtual abolition of the mechanisms of democracy in Victoria. His insistence that Parliament should not sit is unambiguously a disgrace. The Chief Health Officer recommended against Parliament sitting, but that's because the government didn't define it as an essential function. If you can rig up a commercial abattoir to operate safely, you can do the same for the state parliament. He went on, there's never been a more arrogant episode of disdain for normal democracy than the Victorian Health Minister's decision not to answer any questions on the virus this week in the Legislative Council, sitting only because the Coalition and crossbenchers insisted. Andrews does not control the Legislative Council. Writes Greg Sheridan, the arrogance of Andrews and his team has resulted in preventable deaths, the destruction of Australian businesses and billions more in debt. Well, there was a news poll last month that indicated 61% are satisfied with Mr Andrews' handling of the coronavirus and his personal satisfaction rating is still at 57%. Is the Premier's arrogance and incompetence matched only by our indifference? I suppose George Bernard Shaw, the famous playwright, had Daniel Andrews in mind when he wrote, and I quote, "He knows nothing and he thinks he knows everything. That points clearly to a political career."